Okay, hi and welcome back. For my look through the 30s, I've decided to focus on a gangster film, which was a very dominant genre in that decade, and it's from 1939 and it's called The Roaring Twenties, featuring Jimmy Cagney and an earlier role from Humphrey Bogart before he became a leading man himself. But in the 1930s, the dominant genres had been established, a number of them listed here. But what happened more interestingly was that certain studios became renowned for making a certain kind of genre. So, for example, Universal made many horror films like the early Frankenstein films and Dracula, etc. MGM became known for glamour, and consequently, they ended up making quite a lot of musicals. But if one studio ruled the roost when it came to gangster movies, it was Warner Brothers, who became known for a certain gritty realism that would have been recognized at the time as being more naturalistic than the other dominant genres. However, obviously compared to what we would consider realism in this day and age, there isn't really any comparison. Nonetheless, they still stand the test of time, and my favourite of the cycle of gangster movies that were made in the 30s is the Roaring Twenties. Why were gangster movies so popular in the 30s? Well, it comes down to one simple thing. Between 1919 and 1931, the American government introduced prohibition, the abolition of the production and sale of alcohol. A temperance movement swept across America. And of course, this led to the rise of gangsters and bootleggers importing and making illegal liquor. Gangster movies had what we would call ripped from the headlines authenticity to them, which was added to by the fact that many producers and screenwriters had emerged from the world of newspapers. These were men who may have known personally and written about criminals and gangsters. So the stories found themselves being based on actual people, quite a rarity in this particular time. As I said, for me, the Roaring Twenties is the last really in the gangster cycle, and arguably the best. This began with, we could call it a holy triumvirate, three movies from the very early 30s. Little Caesar, which was 1931, Public Enemy in 1932, and Scarface, which I have wrongly identified here as being from 1931, but I do believe it's in a 1932 movie. Scarface featured the remarkable talents of Paul Muni, who was an early exponent of something that we would now probably regard as being the method. Little Caesar made famous the very wonderful Edward G. Robinson, who went on to play gangsters later on in his career with Humphrey Bogart and Key Largo. But The Public Enemy, which was Cagney's first major gangster film, exploded onto the scene and launched a man who was clearly a vibrant and unique talent. There is no question that the Volstead Act, the introduction of the Volstead Act, which heralded in the abolition of alcohol, and the subsequent rise of the bootleggers, led to a climate on the city streets of Chicago and New York particularly, of quite intense gang rivalry, as Irish, Italian, Jewish gangsters primarily vied for control over the liquor trade. Ultimately, as we know, the Italians triumphed for a considerable period, and what became known as the Mafia or Cosa Nostra became the preeminent criminal organization. Of course, in cinema this reaches its absolute apex with The Godfather, which is fairly undisputably the greatest gangster film ever made, and some would also argue the greatest film about America. However, this is essentially about the Roaring Twenties, and it came to these gangster movies in the 30s. Nobody was bigger than Cagney. He was cinema's quintessential tough guy. Between Public Enemy, Angels with Dirty Faces, Each Dawn I Die, and White Heat, there are at least four absolute bona fide classics in his repertoire. And these are only the tough guy movies. What people seem to forget about Cagney was that he always considered himself a song and dance man. You know, if you doubt that, just have a look at the biopic of George Cohan, Yankee Doodle Dandy, which is arguably one of his best roles. Cagney was able to bring a theatrical exuberance to the screen, but coupled with a rock-hard street sensibility that made there something electrifying about his performances. He is known and considered to be one of the greatest screen actors of all time, and for good reason. One of my favourite quotes by Cagney, which I think really speaks volumes about what he did or what he tried to do on screen. And Cagney said, when asked about what acting was to him, he said, you learn your lines, you find your mark, you look the other fella in the eye, and you tell the truth. There's no finer description of what acting should be, I think, than that. I'll take a little sideways dart now, just to acknowledge, in the Roaring Twenties, the presence of one Humphrey Bogart. Because if the 1930s belonged to Jimmy Cagney, the 1940s saw the rise and domination, really, of Hollywood movies of Humphrey Bogart. Perhaps what the Roaring Twenties managed to solidify, managed to consolidate, was an idea that was clearly present in the other three major gangster films that I mentioned. And that was this idea of the American gangster being a reflection, really, of the American dream. The American gangster tended to be someone who came from a very disadvantaged background, who was scrabbling to get what he wanted to get what he needed to get to make a life for himself against really insurmountable odds. We're talking about America, a very tumultuous period of its history. And many people would argue that the American gangster, the rise of the gangster, not simply in cinema but in the world as well, was really quite an appropriate metaphor for the desperation that a desire to gain the American dream. Typically they were rise and fall stories. Certainly they never ended up with the gangster on top, because morally that would have been unacceptable for an audience in the 30s. An audience always liked to see the bad guy get their comeuppance, even indeed if at some point in the story they'd find themselves rooting for the bad guys. Gangster films had to be cautionary tales. It would be morally dubious if they were not. They charted, to a greater or lesser extent, the reckless abandon of the 1920s, referred to often in history books as the Jazz Age. But of course the 20s ended with the depression of the 30s, the Wall Street collapse, and absolute devastation for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people across America. So despite the fact that an audience identified with the gangster and their desires, and they lived through their vicarious thrills the gangster's life, ultimately the gangster has to fall. Why is the rise and fall story of the Roaring Twenties so much more potent, profound even, than perhaps The Public Enemy or Scarface or Little Caesar? Well, without doubt, it's the most modern of the films, not simply because it's been made some 8 years later than the rest of them, but because of the fact that there are various techniques used in the filmmaking that give it a greater dynamism and propulsion. And of course it has this pitch-perfect performance by Cagney as Eddie Bartlett, who begins as a reluctant hoodlum returning from the First World War, unable to get his job back, falls into crime, does a little bit of time, and then goes full throttle into it. Why? Because he doesn't really have any other options. And it's this tragedy, the fact that Eddie Bartlett is undoubtedly a tragic hero, that ultimately makes the Roaring Twenties not simply a riveting watch, but a really moving film, finally. As if this tragedy wasn't potent enough, the director, Raoul Walsh, chooses to frame the last shot of the movie as a living pieta and draws an explicit link between the sacrifice of Christ and the gangster's downfall. A beautiful image, but a very bold move for the time. And undoubtedly we have to owe that bold move to the director, Raoul Walsh, man who'd been making short silence from very early days. Had worked with D.W. Griffith on A Birth of a Nation, and was renowned as a legendary tough guy director. Went on to make many, many more great films. But as I've said before, there is no doubt that the movie belonged to Jimmy Cagney. I personally consider it one of the first truly modern films. It has a feel to it that I feel is unmatched, certainly in the gangster films of the period. As a piece of cinema, as a social document, it works on every level. But finally, with thrills and spills both, it still manages to be an honest appraisal of what for Americans was a tremendously tumultuous decade.